sort of talk a little bit about why I ended up having an interest in China. Because it wasn't just random. I spent about 10 years going back and forth teaching for Utah State University in a program that taught a joint economics degree that was awarded by Utah State with the Ministry of Education in China's authorization, Chinese universities. So I would fly back and forth a few times a year and be teaching on site. And I started to discover a number of things that influenced the way I looked at the issues. What do you notice about this slide? Lots of Western style buildings, right? It's very difficult until you really start to hone in on a few details that this is probably in China, right? What are the things in this picture that make us recognize that it might be in a middle-sized Chinese city? Well, the square isn't connected to anything is the first thing, right? So this square doesn't have anything going around it. Western cities, you would have lots of transit connections into the square, right? So that's the first thing. And the second thing is the colors also give us some indication, right? You would believe me if I said this was in a Western European city. Well, maybe not an American city. We don't generally build things that's pretty anymore, but it doesn't necessarily jump out and say this is in China. And that was striking the first times I went. Other times, this was a view from a hotel I would stay at when I would go. And again, what do we notice about this image? Okay, we have the White Temple in the middle, and you can recognize parts of the skyline, right? It's pretty clearly Beijing, but it has a really interesting mix. We can see the White Temple in the center, we can see some architecture down here, some of the roof pitches, but out beyond that, only interspersed do we see lots of strong indications that it would be Chinese-style architecture, right? Or uniquely Chinese, I should say. So I had never studied China. I was brought in to teach economics, particularly law and economics in this program, and I ended up doing that because the rest of my department, for some really strange reason, did not want to have the university pay for them to visit China 3 or 4 times a year. No idea why that was the case. So I'm like, young assistant professor, I say, well, I'll do that. That sounds great. And so I got to spend a bit of time. And a couple of things I learned while I really started to get me interested in discussion. On the first arrival, the thing that strikes me was the similarity, not the difference. There was lots of things that looked very familiar in architecture and other things, and then you'd start to notice some of the differences. This is a couple that I annoyed the heck out of one evening walking through a night market. She does not like me. I kept distracting her and trying to ask her questions about what they were doing. I think it was her granddaughter that she sends out basically to yell at me and to answer the questions. But what was fascinating was when we would talk about what it was and why they were running this stall. What do you think the answers I finally did get from her were? Well, she was dealing with all the same questions that most people do, and that is, how do you provide for a family? How do you stabilize your own economic reality? And how do you proceed? And that's, I think, the most striking thing that I start with. Now, you might ask, so this is supposedly a book about US-China relations, and why on earth does this guy come up here and start with this? Well, part of the answer comes from much of the misunderstanding, I think, that exists in US policy. And that is that there's something so radically different we can't possibly understand. And some of that will end up being true, but at the core, many of the same impulses, many of the same desires underlie what human beings want. And public choice economics starts with that assumption. That individuals will have preferences, they will take actions to achieve those preferences within the institutions or rules of the game that they have to follow. And when we start to look at people in that way, we can start to reveal a whole host of the reasons for their behavior. So let's talk about this guy. Most people don't have a very deep understanding beyond he's either the leader of a great nation, or he's a dictator who's oppressing people, or he's the head of a communist party and therefore he's problematic. That's about the level of sophistication we usually get with Xi. But Xi isn't, at its core, any different than this couple. He still has things he desires, and he's going to take action to do those things. And while this one we can look at and say, well, hopefully they're doing great things and making people's lives better off, maybe this one not so much. But the approach and our understanding of who they are remains the same. We're going to start with a story. This is where I start to draw Ethan in and make him do this with me. Tell us about the event you went to that opens the book.
There's a senator, he's giving a speech, very interesting Senate speech as they go.
So it's a legal policy event, and what's the topic?
Well, he's talking about whatever, but my question to him was, how should the U.S. approach forced intellectual property transfers to do business in China for American companies? The response is that American companies, Western companies and financiers are selling the Chinese Communist Party the rope that they're going to use to hang the United States.
It's a typical tough-talking China response, right? From lots of elected officials. I want you to just pause for a second, that if this is where we start, what are the set of options in front of us? If this is what the baseline belief is that Western businesses are selling the Chinese Communist Party the rope it will use to hang us. What does that give us as a set of options in terms of policy?
Cut the rope.
Well, we could cut the rope, that's one thing. We could just stop interacting with China. What's that going to look like? I don't know about you, but I enjoy purchasing a relatively large number of inexpensive manufactured goods that are produced in China. Most of us, if we reflect for very long and went through our cupboards, we'd see we all probably do something similar. Maybe a few of you are way more principled and disciplined and don't. But in general, it would be costly. What are the other options? If you believe that we're selling them, what does that say about the assumptions of their intentions? That not only are they a competitor, or are they problematic, or they may do things that we disagree with, it ascribes a whole bunch of bad intentionality to it. And this is the typical sort of political approach to this. There's a flip side approach, right? We would call them China doves. What would the China doves have said? Charge them more, that's possible, but maybe it's just not a problem at all and not something we should think about. That we should just allow it to go forward and it's no big deal. We don't have to think about it because trade will just simply lead to democracy and a whole host of things. Anybody remember that theory from the 1990s? What was that theory? So democracies don't go to war, trade will lead to liberalization, not just in economics, but also in democratic movements, and all will be well, and everything will be wonderful, and there will be rainbows, etc. Well, it turns out that's not how that works. We've seen that play out a number of times. It turns out that's equally as problematic of a way to talk about it. But it turns out there are lots of incentives for politicians to talk about it in just this way. Why would US politicians usually end up in one of those two camps? But why do they end up in this camp, in the China hawk camp? We haven't had any real China doves for a while. Why do they end up here? It's easy to campaign on, and it sounds really good, right? We are going to defeat evil. We are going to vanquish competitors or enemies, all those sorts of things that have worked in getting politicians elected for a very long time. We see that pretty clearly, right? We can see the incentives on the US side. We're going to talk about the incentives that exist a little bit on the other side. So, well, these are three examples of potential China hawks. You can try to figure out or read the book which one was giving the event that Ethan was at, but they've all said some variation of those sorts of things over the course of their time in the Senate. Now, so the political approaches we see really clearly, right? But it turns out there's also a set of academic approaches in the field of international relations. So normally this is the part of the presentation where the international relations scholars that taught me in graduate school, they feel terrible inside because I'm about to say not particularly nice things about international relations as a discipline, in part because of how their theories view states. The traditional approach in international relations is to view states as singular actors and emphasize foreign policy actions over domestic considerations. We think about states as single entities that are interacting in the global sphere, and most of the time international relations puts explicitly domestic considerations out of the equation. The most extreme of these, generally called the realists, would argue that domestic considerations have almost no impact on how countries behave because we're existing in a power competition model between states. And because we end up viewing those countries as though they're rational actors on their own, divorced from their domestic politics, we end up stopping short of understanding the incentives that those that are in leadership or in power in those countries face. And so our approach is somewhat different. Our approach says thinking about countries as singular states can be useful insofar as it takes us down a path of analyzing behavior. But when we think about public choice as its own discipline, at its very core, public choice is it's an approach to political economy that leverages the tools of economics in areas that are traditionally dominated by political science and sociology. And it argues that political actors primarily make self-interest decisions much like individuals do in the private sector. In particular, it's going to explore the incentive structures that drive political decision-making, whether those are constitutional restraints, electoral pressures, or raw institutional power. When we think about how the US makes decisions, we're very cognizant of the public choice implications of how those decisions get made. Very few people would argue that the US arrives at a singular policy in the foreign affairs sector without any consideration of the domestic policy. If it did, we wouldn't put these guys on the slide, and what they had to say wouldn't really matter all that much because it would be divorced from the politics of the US. And when we got to reading a lot of the books that have been written about US-China relations, what we found was there wasn't a lot of this being done. There were little bits of it slipped into things, but nothing that actually took the incentives and pressures that underpin the CCP's sometimes draconian or bizarre policies and actually asked the question, what motivates those in power to take these actions? And then how do those actions lead to interaction on the international stage? That's where we start in the book, is we start with the assumption that if you're going to understand international relations, you have to understand domestic policy and how those decisions about foreign policy actually get made inside the individual countries. As we say in the book, it's one thing to have an encyclopedic knowledge of China, Chinese domestic and foreign policies. Lots of books have been written on that. I'm going to presume we could find a number of those books in this store. I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of Chinese domestic and foreign policy. And our goal in the book is to then hand you and others a set of tools you can use to think about it. We also don't know what the right policy is. I have a set of policy preference, Ethan has a set, but we can think about these things using that set of tools. And we're going to talk for the rest of our time together about some of the issues we see and why public choice helps to advance. So let's talk about some what we think are potentially unproductive ways to approach China, or approach thinking about US-Chinese relations. So pure realism, national security, great power competition, that liberal theory of trade liberalization, very popular in the 1990s. They were going to sow soccer balls in Beijing, they'd have McDonald's, and then we'd have free elections. But there's also a cultural explanation that's been around for a long time. It has a new name, right? It's gotten changed. Well, it is racism. But it gets talked about as the Confucian background, those sorts of things. In the old days, if you go back and read literature from the 1960s, it had a really terrible name, and it was called the Orientalist theory of international relations. It's a cultural explanation. So if you want to understand what's going on, you just have to understand they're different. Well, I'm not convinced by that. And then we have this doozy of a gift from modern sociology and anthropology and English departments, weirdly, and that is colonial power dynamics and the effect that it has. And they all think about these things at this singular state level or societal. So let's talk about our methodology a little, because we've come up with something a little bit different. We're going to talk about public choice, not monolithic public interest for the good or the bad. We're going to have to talk about the system, so a Leninist system versus a liberal democracy or a semi-liberal democracy, depending on the mood I'm in on any given day. And we're going to talk about political economy, not moral economy. That we're going to ask questions about how things operate and what drives the decision making. So we're going to start that basic assumption that economics always begins with, that we're going to have rational, self-interested citizens. They have preferences and they'll take actions to achieve them, as opposed to some inherently subservient or anti-capitalist citizen that is ideologically tied into the state as the base. There's not a lot of evidence that this is what's there. Let's talk a little bit about economic growth. One of the things that we identified very, very quickly was that the transition after Mao and the beginning of the opening of China, through sort of Xi's ascendancy, economic growth was the major justification for the rule of the CCP. If you listen to lots of what they talk about, if you watch what's happening in China, They point to inflated growth rates, but it turns out they're really good at inflating them. In fact, they're so good that economists can estimate the inflation that's in the growth rate and come up with something back from some great papers out there that do exactly that roll back the estimates and get to something more rational. But this is the argument that they make. They're interested in their justification for staying in power in talking about how economic growth, the standard of living, has been rising during the period that they've been in power. And they pivot to that over and over again. And they hear about a government that's serving the interests of the people, tied back to economic growth. And in the end, as we look at these things, the question are often asked is, how does China get the miracle of growth? Well, that's not a very interesting question. It turns out trade, economic liberalization, all those things allow growth to happen astronomically. It's been a pattern that's been around for most of human history. The more interesting question is, why did a Leninist system with some authoritarian tendencies decide first to liberalize and then to continue? And for us, where we find that answer is in the individual leaders' desire to remain in power. And it was, in fact, one of the best, easiest, consistent things they could point to that said, we're in power and these things are getting better. Now, that starts to come apart really sort of in the recent past, but there are some initial fractures in that as far back as the Tiananmen Square incident. Once we get past and into the liberalization phase, economic growth is the focus. Now, China hits the same problem that every developing economy hits that if it's successful. That at some point they reach what we call the middle income trap, and delivering consistent economic growth at the same rates as before is no longer possible. And as a result, part of what we see is a pivot in the language that gets used to justify the CCP's remaining in power, and we see different political figures use that language differently. Xi moves to a very different language than his predecessors, in part, at least, because of the change in the economic reality. So one of the things that I found striking was right at the start of the period where I was in China quite a lot. And that's the period where they started at the front of every movie. I got to know some folks in the Chinese film industry, and I would end up going to see a fair number of movies in Mandarin. Yeah, I don't know what those movies were about, but I was there. But at the front of those movies, what did they have? You'll see a movie in China, what's at the front of the movie? So we have an approval, and then we have a talk about the Chinese dream. It shows up in virtually every one of those movies in the period, talking about how great China is and how important it is on the world stage. And this is something it's very clearly done where they begin to talk about Chinese nationalism rather than Chinese economic growth.
I've been fascinated with authoritarian countries and why their governments essentially liberalize or refuse to liberalize, and why citizens in those countries decide to either put up with it or rebel, right? It's been a fascinating question, especially just given the different results that we've seen throughout the world. China in particular, as well as Vietnam, definitely have a very similar trajectory and story. But this is an economic growth chart of China, right? And so we have some important points, such as reform and opening under Deng Xiaoping, the ascension to the WTO. And you can see, as Ryan was explaining, that the CCP, for a while until recently, has been focusing on economic growth, ensuring that living standards improve every single year. And that ensures that Chinese citizens, regardless of how much they disagree with the government, are happy with how things are going on. And this is a pretty common story across the world in terms of how most authoritarian governments remain in power. And so one of the interesting things that I was trying to explore is, why did they decide to switch to that model when other countries, for example, like North Korea, have not? And so if you look at this graph, right, you can see this big dip down here. This is the Great Leap Forward. Great Leap Forward is a failed economic policy that resulted in mass starvation, essentially unleashed a very comprehensive and very flawed economic plan that led to a severe mismanagement of resources. Bottom line, a lot of people starve. But what happens after that, right? So now we actually see some slight economic growth happening right after that. And so that was actually the most interesting part, which ties into where I'm about to go, is that's actually the Cultural Revolution. And so my head was like, why is there economic growth during the Cultural Revolution? Which is another chaotic part of Chinese history. The difference is during the Cultural Revolution, which then immediately ties into Deng Xiaoping ascending to power, is that during the Cultural Revolution, that's where we have a systematic loss of power for the Chinese Communist Party. Mao essentially unleashes the Cultural Revolution. After the Great Leap Forward, his political credibility is at an all-time low. And so he decides to essentially attack his political enemies. Many Americans, I think, believe the Cultural Revolution was about attacking Chinese citizens, most of the Cultural Revolution was focused on the party itself. It was a way to purge the party to essentially maintain political dominance. And so while the party was actually infighting, there's a good author named Frank Decoder, many of you might have read his work, but essentially he went into the records in China. I think he had access to classified files, and he essentially discovered that during the Cultural Revolution, you basically had average Chinese citizens beginning to engage in standard market transactions. So essentially a massive black market erupts because the CCP is too busy fighting itself to essentially prevent these market transactions. And so that's why we have the steady economic growth leading up to 1978 when Deng Xiaoping comes into power. And so the story of Deng Xiaoping is often framed as, once upon a time there's Mao. He's got some terrible ideas. And then all of a sudden, this guy named Deng Xiaoping comes in and he's got some liberal ideas. And although that's, partially true, another part of it is sort of a political survival tactic in the sense that although I'm pretty sure Deng Xiaoping was some sort of market liberal, I think there's no doubt that he subscribed to those ideas. I don't think it's probable to say that he was a true believer. And you also have to think about how the rest of the CCP had to essentially endorse those market reforms, right? It's not just Deng Xiaoping in charge. And so what Frank Decoder's thesis is, and which I find quite persuasive, is that at the time, because essentially most of China is already engaging in these market practices, if they came in and stopped that would essentially be a revolution. They had to go along with it because if they didn't, that would be an immediate loss of power for the party. Political power is already at an all-time low. So market liberalization, as our theme essentially suggests, was a tactic to stay in power, to maintain power for the party, as well as ensure that Chinese people get better living standards year on year. So there's an inherently political / a power maximizing incentive behind these liberalization measures. A good example I like to tie it to was Lenin during the Soviet Union. So immediately after the Soviet Union is established, when they tried essentially full-blown communism, the economy, surprise, surprise, plummets into the toilet. And so Lenin actually, in order to maintain the party's hold on power, does something very similar. And this is sort of a story that I think many of us have forgotten, it's sort of been lost to history. But Lenin's quote-unquote new economic policy involved, again, sort of liberalization, the introduction of a gold standard of hard money, right? So a lot of pro-market reforms that brought the Soviet Union out of a crisis. In both these countries, we see the use of market liberalism essentially to reinstate power and eventually turn it back into political power once economic growth has become sufficient, right? So that's an interesting story about the relationship between the CCP and economic growth. And I think we're seeing a lot of that today in the sense that now that economic growth has been quite sufficient, but also slowing down, we're starting to see a pivot into different types of policies to maintain power. Once they've hit the middle income trap, they can't keep it going for long without some pretty substantial reforms that we'll get into. Xi Jinping, I think we all understand, has taken China substantially against the market liberalization wave. Right now, he's sort of doing a back and forth between, okay, I don't like free markets, oh, I do like free markets. He started writing this book back in 2021. This was essentially probably peak political power maximization. There's a campaign called the Common Prosperity Campaign. Essentially, what that entailed was he would start attacking the largest tech companies in China with antitrust lawsuits. The CCP started creating a narrative that these large Chinese firms were becoming unaccountable to China. They needed to be reined in, and I think the exact English translation was capital growing at a disorderly pace. It was framed as a income inequality mitigation measure. He's saying, these big tech companies, just like here in America, we have the exact same talking points. They're getting too powerful, they are causing too much trouble, they are harming our citizens. And now the CCP is coming in to fix this, right? And so he attacks them. They lose billions of dollars overnight. It's a very chaotic time for the Chinese stock market. I don't even think it's recovered since then, right? Some pretty brazen economic intervention that tanks the Chinese economy and drives a lot of outside onlookers and makes them very confused. What a better explanation is, and I think it's the most clear explanation, is that he was thinking about how the large tech firms were essentially becoming alternate power centers. So instead of being obedient tech companies, you get people like Jack Ma who get up on a large stage and say, oh, I don't think this financial regulation that the CCP is doing is efficient. These tech companies are essentially becoming alternate power centers, alternate centers of influence, and they're drawing attention away from the CCP in a way that makes Xi Jinping extremely uncomfortable, as well as the people that support him in the party, right? So that's why we see the drastic shift to the left in terms of economic intervention. But then once the stock market tanks, foreign capital starts to move out of China, Xi Jinping pumps the brakes really quickly. So the party goes from campaigning on common prosperity. It used to be everywhere. It used to be all over the place. It used to be the hottest thing. And all of a sudden, there's no mention of it whatsoever, right? So we see this drastic shift from hard economic intervention to all of a sudden, Xi Jinping's trying to reassure private companies that the CCP is not going to do something like that again. They actually encourage and respect private companies and private enterprise. And so we see this interesting relationship between economic growth and political power that I think they're still trying to figure that out today. And if you look at his current statements, again, he's making statements on the one hand saying, well, we love private enterprise and we respect it. On the other hand, I think they just kicked out a bunch of American consulting firms. So it's a back and forth of trying to balance the economic growth with the political power. This slide was essentially about, again, sort of the theory that the market liberalization measures were not necessarily because Deng Xiaoping and everyone was in a good mood, but because that it was essentially necessary, right? The Chinese people probably would have revolted. This one author said that the liberalization in China was essentially a parade, and Deng Xiaoping essentially just jumped in front of the parade at the last minute. But there's another high-ranking Chinese official essentially complaining that Deng Xiaoping took his idea, right? There are many people in China who believe that this was a good thing because, again, if they didn't do it, then they would not be in power for long. This is a pretty fascinating case study that I like to think about because this explains essentially why the CCP even became powerful in the first place, right? So this goes back to what Ryan was talking about. There are some schools of thought that say, oh, the Chinese people, they're inherently more socialist. Socialism works better in China than it does in other places, and that's why things are the way they are. Obviously, Taiwan's a pretty glaring example of why that is not the case. This theory that for some reason communism is just better in China was applied to Vietnam before Samuel Popkin. I'm sure many of you have read the book, The Rational Peasant. But Samuel Popkin essentially debunks that myth in Vietnam before the same sort of analysis gets applied to China. So Samuel Popkin goes to Vietnam to essentially study why did Vietnam go communist? Why did the communists win the Vietnamese Civil War? The theory beforehand was called the moral economy. The moral economy essentially suggested that Vietnamese people are part of the global South and they hate capitalism and they're good anti-capitalists just like the rest of their like non-white comrades. I think you hear a lot of this in universities today. What he did was he went there, he interviewed a lot of people, he talked to a lot of people, and essentially it was all about, okay, so if you're a Vietnamese peasant in like the 1950s and you had to choose between the French colonial government that was running things pretty poorly, it was sapping away resources and oppressing everybody, and then the Vietnamese communists who are coming in and doing a lot of community service measures, they're trying to provide public works. Like, which one are you going to choose? You're obviously going to side with the communists in that case, because one side is just awful, the other side's not as awful. And then there was no liberal democratic faction, right? If you're in Vietnam in 1950, it's between the Catholic French colonial government and the villages as side of the thumb. And then there's the communist side when the villages side with those. And the communists were not only providing good public services, but they're out in the community, they're charismatic, they're winning wars against the Japanese, right? They're basically winning hearts and minds. In China, we might call that the mandate of heaven, right? Essentially, which side gives you more stuff, right? If you have to choose between one side that's bad and one side that's slightly better, you're going to choose that side. So how does this relate to China? So a pretty interesting story, Mao goes to Anyang. So this is a pretty iconic painting of Mao going to the village of Anyang. This is essentially where the CCP is really becoming what it is, and Mao is really starting as a political figure. And in fact, this painting is so iconic that I believe it hung in the Vatican because someone believed that was a Chinese Catholic missionary, just because it's just painted in such a reverent way, right? But no, that's actually Mao Zedong, and he hates Catholics, obviously. But that's how important this event is to the story, that he gets paintings that look like that. So Mao goes to Anyang is a very similar story to my lengthy explanation about Vietnam. Mao goes to Anyang, there's a bunch of coal miners, and he's essentially, instead of being like, oh, we're communists, so we're going to take away all your private property and yada, 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 he goes there and he starts talking about how we're going to provide you better living standards, we're going to have some cultural festivities, we're going to provide social health care. He's basically becoming a community organizer. He's going to Anyang, where this very depressed area in feudal China, and he's talking about how basically giving people what they want. Like, okay, we're going to provide public services, we're going to have some community. The communists are essentially becoming a way for people to better their lives. It's not necessarily just a choice between, okay, do you like socialism, or do you like feudalism, or do you like capitalism? It's like they're out in the community talking to people. The average Chinese person then and today probably has not read Marx, does not care, right? But they do care about, again, better living standards. Same thing happens here in the US, right? If you want to win an election, you go around, you canvass, you're out in the community, you're becoming a charismatic figure. The exact same story applies to Mao going into Anyang, where essentially he goes there, and all of a sudden after, once he does his work, it's a very vibrant community, and he essentially wins the confidence of the people of Anyang, and he rinses and repeats all throughout China. And this is a similar story across the world where these communist organizers go around and they provide social services. It is not necessarily the sort of just convincing everyone to go socialist after day one. Britain, where the Labour Party, it's not just a sort of political movement, it's also just where laborers are in the pubs, right? This is your community, these are your friends, right? So they're making it more than just socialism, they're making it your social life and your general welfare. So wolf warrior diplomacy, I'm sure many have heard that term. It's when Chinese diplomats on the world stage act in incredibly aggressive and unproductive ways. And so there's different explanations on why that's the case. Some people would say, well, that's just China asserting itself. Other people would say, well, because China believes, they're center of the world and this is how they're going to act. The correct explanation is that wolf warrior diplomats are not performing for outside diplomats. They're not performing for us. They're performing for people in China because they get promotions when they say really awful and inflammatory things, right? They're trying to appeal to the Chinese masses to show the Chinese people that, China's asserting itself. It's inward facing rather than outward facing. So again, thinking about what are the rational incentives that are in the Chinese system motivating their outward behavior. This essentially wraps up the story of economic liberalization in China, because after enough economic liberalization happens, it turns out that China is not necessarily a communist country, and all of a sudden the idea that China is a communist country gets kind of lost, and now people want change, right? Economic liberalization has led to a bunch of different ideas, and now communism has essentially lost its place as the uniting ideology in China. And so this is where the Tiananmen Square protest happens, and I'm sure we all know how that went, right? But my last slide, essentially what happens after Tiananmen Square, right? So this is where we get to the story of where we are today. Right after Tiananmen Square, the Chinese Communist Party, again, realizes that we can't just rely on economic growth to keep people happy, right? They're starting to think about other things. What they've done, and which is actually interesting because it's antithetical to how traditional communism works, is traditional communism is a stateless international ideology that doesn't believe in the nation state. It also rejects feudal history, right? China has a very proud imperial history. Socialism explicitly rejects that. But then right after 1989, they start to change the curriculum to emphasize China's imperial history, to ground the CCP's rule not in sort of radical socialism, like freeing the working class, but as a fundamentally Chinese nationalist party that has done great things for China and is essentially the descendant, all the great historical facts about China that date back 4,000 years, right? So we see a change in the curriculum right after Tiananmen Square, which is essentially signaling the CCP has realized that this economic growth is not sufficient, that communism has failed to become a uniting ideology, and now that we need to ground our rule in something else, which is nationalism. And that's why we get essentially a radical, widespread change in Chinese curriculum right after 1989. And with that, kick it back to Ryan.
So Ethan walked you through a couple of the case studies from the book. For many in sort of US policy realms, it's easy to look and say, China's doing X, we should respond with Y. But the lesson, I think, of really taking a deeper dive into what motivates that behavior and thinking about some of the public choice questions starts to reveal that no matter how much posturing is done, Chinese leaders are not as invincible in their position as they might seem. They're deeply concerned about whether or not they will be able to maintain power or maintain their position. And in fact, if you look very closely, the current Chairman Xi is really good at taking out people on corruption charges, right? This is one of the things he did as he was moving up the ranks in the Communist Party before he ends up in charge. This ongoing set of concerns that it's not just there's China. There is China as it interacts with its institutions and the competition for power in its system based on its own institutional design. Partly what we see the more we dig is Chinese citizens, rational, self-interested, much like every other human being. They have things they want, they take action to try to achieve them, but they do so within a set of incentives and institutions that are going to be somewhat different. And understanding those institutions and incentives, not just on the world stage, but internally to China also matters. The most obvious of them that I think would be very difficult to get anyone to disagree with is the CCP will take steps to assure it maintains power. But those steps aren't just the repression steps, although that's certainly within the bag of tricks that the CCP is willing to use. There's a whole host of things, and understanding what motivates them gives us a way to think about what likely actions might happen. And so what do? Well, it means that we have to move along the line of rational self-interest, not simply good versus evil or power competition or something else. if we actually want to understand what's happening. If we want to be able to make policy that will move the ball down the road towards the US's own messy system has arrived at its own, what it thinks its own interest is. But it turns out, when we dig in for very long, thinking about the US as a monolithic actor on the global stage, but those domestic considerations have real and important effects. Ask Canada and Mexico about the effect of the last election. I never thought I would be living in a world where our biggest economic adversaries would somehow be the Canadians. Still don't know how that's where we ended up, but that's where we are. And we ended up there not because of some grand power competition. We ended up there because of US domestic policy. And the same is going to be true if we want to understand China. Kissinger has written many terrible books about China. His last one, I think, is a real terrible one, and I can give you all the reasons when I'm not being recorded for why. But Kissinger, when he was a diplomat, made a really important observation that he used to talk about with the diplomatic corps. And that is that if you want to understand what the possible outcomes are, you have to know the people at the table. That's really the core public choice insight. You have to know the people, you have to know the incentives they face and what their goals and desires are. And then you can start to make better predictions about how they might behave. It means sometimes you have to look past what the CCP says and look at what the actual fundamental motivating interests are. And with that, we're happy to take any questions or for however much time we have left.
Where do you guys see the personality and bias of the two leaders, Xi Jinping versus Trump, play into this? Is that sort of orthogonal, another dimension overlapping with public choice, or it's part of that consideration?
So there are two ways to answer that question. The very strict public choice economist in me says that's going to be a consideration that gets wrapped up into how they behave within the institution. I do think that that's too simplistic of a response in the sense that it does end up mattering in terms of how the institutional arrangements allow them to take unilateral action or to respond to the other side. That is clearly a public choice argument. The personalities matter a lot, and we've seen those personalities go back and forth. It'll be interesting to watch the current version of President Trump's personality, which is somewhat different than first-term President Trump's personality at the moment. I suspect we'll revert towards the mean as we go on a ways, and Xi's personality, how they interact. One of the things I think that's telling is the messaging on tariffs towards China from Trump has been very restrained. I think there is a recognition that an attempt to extract concessions in the way his administration has tried with Mexico, Canada, and others very clearly doesn't work. It would not work with Xi, it's not likely to be effective, and in fact it's likely to just shut down the interaction. I think his team understands that that interaction is much more fraught than other interactions. As a result, the desire to stand tough on China, especially over the long run, means that you have to have a consistent response as opposed to the ping-ponging we do at the moment on everybody else. That's my interpretation, and probably as I'm saying that out loud, there's an executive order that's going to contradict me. So we've seen a very consistent number for tariffs on China that has moved within a very small window with regard to China once he was elected. Before election, it was all over the board, but once he actually took office, it stayed pretty constrained in that window.
When it comes to CCP decision making, right, they're still operating in a revolutionary Marxist-Leninist system. And so what that means at a practical level is when they're communicating ideas and problems and solutions, that gets filtered to some extent through the lens of nationalism and that Marxist revolutionary philosophy. I think it's plausible to say that that tempers those decisions, but I felt that that wasn't sufficiently addressed in the early chapters. And how you guys explain that?
I'm going to do the classic economist thing, and I'm going to quibble with your premise just a little bit. Because I'm not certain I would describe it as a Leninist decision-making apparatus that involves interlocking directorates. I actually think the revolutionary side of that transitioned in the 1970s, and it became a power maintenance. Because revolutionary activity of the sort we saw under Mao, where we saw a very large number of purges in the inner circle, especially right around the time that Mao is sort of reaching the end of his life, he is sort of emblematic of that revolutionary phase, where there's a continual push to keep the revolution marching forward. One of the things I think Mao learns from some of what he does relatively early on is that continual revolution means that you're always at risk of being revolted against as well. It was something that the Soviets learned as well, into transition. But the interesting bit about the question is the form and function of the interlocking directorates of a Leninist system and how that happens in China, at least for me. Because those interlocking directorates means that while you have a deep desire to control power centrally, those directorates end up dividing power and incentivizing people to want to move up through the ranks. And we can trace Xi's own rise in the Communist Party through the community level, the provincial level, and into the Central Party as he moves up. And so part of what's going on through all of that, is it revolutionary in the sense of the continual revolution of Marx and of other communist thinkers? I don't think it quite fits. In some ways, it looks a little bit like revolution with Chinese characteristics, perhaps, but it is that continuing sort of reality of those interlocking directorates. Because in order to advance, you have to move from directorate to directorate. Otherwise, you get stalled, you don't move up in the party. And if you're desirous to gain power, that's where you're going to end up.
My answer to that is that I would think about it in the same way that we think about American politicians, in the sense that we live in a liberal democracy, but does every senator and congressman think through the lens of liberal democracy, quote unquote? Does every Republican think through the lens of conservatism? Does every Democrat think like a progressive? Of course they have that ideology in the background, but it's tempered to, you know, whatever the rational incentives are at play, right? You can't be ultra progressive or ultra conservative. If you get voted out, then what's the point of doing that, right? There's a sort of like a reality checks the ideology. And so of course I do think that it's important to have a general understanding of Marxist-Leninism and socialism with Chinese characteristics, as Xi Jinping has a doctorate, I believe, in socialist ideology. That is there, it's in their heads, but at the same time, what is more important is what incentives are, right? So in order to move up, in order to stay in power, what are the realistic forces at play that they need to apply that ideology to? And that tends to work out in a far more pragmatic and less ideological result.
You talked about, like, there are lots of examples of countries where they go one way or not, or the other way in terms of liberalizing. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about Taiwan. Do you think it really boils down to the leader, or were there structural forces at play that...
Yeah, I think similar to my explanation about Deng Xiaoping liberalizing China, there's always a bigger picture at play. Oftentimes one leader is not powerful enough to do anything, and the system and all the people around him. There are many theories. Let's call the theories different forces, right? There's many different explanations of why Taiwan liberalized. They all contribute, and then we can argue for about a couple hours about which one was the most important one, right? The Republic of China got booted out of the UN, right? That was a pretty clear panic mode of like, oh shoot, we're out of the UN, like what do we do now, right? In order to gain legitimacy and higher standing with the international community, as well as the US, liberal democracy was one of the answers, right? So that's one explanation. I think that's important. My paper was essentially arguing that in Taiwan, pretty heavy American influence. I mean, the Republic of China and the Nationalist Chinese were essentially supported very closely by the Americans during the Chinese Civil War. And when they went to Taiwan, America was essentially the security guarantor. And then we can perhaps argue whether or not we currently still are the security guarantor, but right, the American influence was pretty heavy. So that's another explanation. My personal explanation was that there's a Taiwanese nationalist movement that was separate from the Republican Chinese in charge. The nationalist Chinese that essentially created the modern Taiwanese state, and then there's a bunch of Chinese people who moved there a couple hundred years ago, plus Taiwanese, like actual Taiwanese natives who have no genetic date back to China and have something closer to like Papua New Guinea, right? People who've been in Taiwan for like way longer than the Chiang Kai-shek regime. Essentially, that tension between the nationalist Chinese government and essentially like this nativist nationalist Taiwanese movement created a necessity to have a democracy, or else that nationalist movement would essentially probably rebel. So in order to give them representation and prevent rebellion, the nationalist Chinese in charge had to essentially give political representation and therefore democracy to what was essentially a boiling up nationalist Taiwanese movement.
But what I would say is I think there's a very much a public choice style story, which is the question of the incentives they faced, the interests they had, led them to take actions that brought them down this road. Public choice doesn't tell you what the outcome will be, it just tells you a way in which how you can look at it to try to understand it more. And so thank you all very much.